Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Students, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another lecture. Welcome to another morning. Today we are going to start a new method, that is, which method? The communicative language teaching. We also call it communicative approach. Do you know which lecture is today? Lecture number 18. Okay, good students. You remember what did we talk about in the last lecture? Yes, we talked about total physical response, right? TPR. So, do you remember what did we talk about in that method? Yes, we talk about physical actions. We talk about language coordination, and we saw that language is learned through actions. And we saw in that method that what we saw coordination between actions and language. And in that method also, you remember that we saw the teacher speaks and he performs actions, and the student, what they do, they listen initially and they learn. So that was in fact TPR. So today, before I start another important method, that is the communicative approach, I will try to review the previous method briefly. Let's start without wasting a moment, because we are running short of time. Now we have to enhance our pace. So dear students, last week we talked about TPR. Who gave this method? James Ussher. Alright, so what does James Ussher say? Right, he says that, well, that there is coordination. Find that foreign language teaching requires a coordination between language and actions. And how did he develop his method, student? He developed his methods by observing his children learning language. And he, in James Ussher, in fact, is of the view that the parent-child relation, the way the parent perform action, and they say or they give command, and the children follow those commands. So that's why, of course, he gave this method, that there is total physical TPR, total physical response method, is a way in which what happens, that what we, in fact, we perform actions, we give commands, we speak, and our learners, they follow it. That you have seen in the class, that what happens, that the teacher, in fact, she performs actions, she gives some commands, and the students respond. Fine. So that's why we saw in this method that there is what coordination between actions and the language. And naturally, if you see around that, of course, if somebody performs actions and he says something, and followers can easily follow that. Learning can be easily done in this way. But if somebody just says something and he doesn't perform any action, yeah, learning could be there, but not to that extent. Fine. But if somebody does something and then he also speaks, so you will see that the learner, in fact, copies his actions. Fine. He, in fact, registers his actions and also the words of the speaker. So learning would definitely be more effective in this way. Clear? So that is, of course, this method. Also we call that method comprehension approach, because the learners listen, right? And then they try to speak. The roles reverse after some time. After 20 hours of instruction, we saw that the learner, what he does, the learner, they start, in fact, speaking as well. Fine. So what happens? The teacher, in fact, models first. He gives a model in the first phase. The teacher speaks and acts. Fine. And the students follow. And we also saw that during that process, the teacher keeps on bringing what? New commands in the mid of the previous commands, to check that whether students have understood the previous command or not, and to check that whether students have learned it or they have simply memorized it. So that's why we saw that student in fact enjoyed learning, because there was no stress. Why? They were acting, they were performing actions, and definitely that learning was more useful, that learning was more meaningful. Fine. And you see that if you learn something in this way, so your performance definitely increases. So again we saw that the listening, of course, that takes place in TPR has two purposes. First, understanding, and second also, once the teacher gives commands and the teacher gives imperative commands, so what happens? The learning takes place, of course, and the grammar is taught but implicitly, not explicitly. Is that clear? And of course, my dear students, that this is the only method that in fact focuses on listening more. We saw other methods where you see there are other means are there, but this is the only method where which in fact highlights listening skills. So that's why the Jam Ussher, and Jam Ussher is of the view that, well, of course we can teach different grammatical items through this total physical response method. And again he called it method a natural process. Why? Because the natural process of language acquisition is this way, that we start listening first. A child acquires language first by listening. He listens to his parents, listens to his siblings, and then he starts speaking. Fine. And then he starts reading, and finally he starts writing. So this is, Jam Ussher calls it a natural process. Why? Because of course this is the way we follow. This is the natural process of language acquisition. So we need to follow the same process for language learning as well. So this is what the Jam Ussher of course is of the view. Yes, trainees, you understand? Any problem? Fine? Okay, all right. So this was the method TPR, total physical response, where we perform actions and we learn. By the way, how did you find this method? How was it? Did you enjoy it? Yes, I can see your faces. You really enjoyed this method. Why? Because this talks about actions, right? And it reduces anxiety level of the student, and students in fact exercise and they learn. So it is again, this method has of course dual purposes. The one that it energizes the student, it activates the students, fine, it motivates the students, and they learn also. Fine. So there is full-fledged physical activity and there is learning. And once you perform physical activities, so your stress level decreases, your anxiety in fact decreases, and of course once you are free of stress, there is no problem, so learning would be faster. Is that clear? So that is what this method talks about, and now you can see that. Fine. Can you adopt this method in your teaching once you will be in this field? Fine. Or if you are practicing teacher, try, can TTPR be a success if you apply it? Fine. If not, why not? If it is a success, yes, what in fact makes it success, or what else can you add to it? You being teacher, you being student, what can you add in it? In fact, how can you improve this method? Fine. Think of it, in fact, students. Well, you can improve the method. Fine. Or definitely you are young people, you are creative people, and every teacher, of course, should be creative. And since you are student of TEFL, you are the future teachers, you are the future consultants, you are and you have potential to be a good instructor, a good TEFL teacher, right? And also a good, above all, language teacher. So this is one of the methods, total physical response, the method. And here we saw that, of course, in our class, there were children, in fact, and they were learning English through this method. And again, it doesn't mean that only this method can be used for children. No, you can use this method for adults as well. Fine. This method can equally be used for other age groups, right? So once you try it, you will feel that how successful you are, right? Or what are the weaknesses of this method, and if you have to improve, what else can we do? So you can do research on that, my dear students, if you have, of course, a research background, or if you are research oriented, which is the need of the time, my dear students. So what you can do, you can see that, you can study this method, you can know more about this method and see that what are the gray areas in this method, what are the strengths of this method, and if we have to apply this method in our teaching, what can we do? How can we improve this method? What values can we add in this method? And we can do that. Fine, we can do it. Fine, provided, yes, you read more, provided you of course interact with the people who are using this this method practically. Fine, clear? All right. So I hope you will observe this method more, and I hope you will try to apply this method. Or if you are, if you are planning to have your own, of course, institute somewhere, you will ask the teachers to have this method. And if you have to teach foreign English, so then you would definitely try this method, fine, for foreign language teaching. Clear? Fine. Have you understood? Happy now? All right. Let's start now today's method. Very important method. What is it? What do we call this method? Yes, students? Yeah, CLT. Very important method. What is it? Name shows communication, communicative approach. Fine. Teaching in the target language. Again, you would say, well, you go back to direct method where we didn't use native language. So here the approach is almost the same idea, students. Fine. Here the approach is same. What we do? Yeah. Our objective is to be able to interact in this language, to be able to communicate in this language. So communicative approach. And how we can achieve it? Again, through interaction, through communication. Like we saw in the direct method, learning the target language by using the target language. Clear? So that was, and again here, over there, the objective was to learn the target language, fine, by using the target language. Here mean to communicate in the target language by communicating in the target language. So that is what this CLT says, that well, it's an approach to language teaching that emphasizes what? Interaction as the means and the ultimate goal of study. Clear? So as a means, right? What does the mean mean? The way, in fact. This is the way. Fine. And again, that is our goal as well. The goal is to be good communicator, right? To be able to communicate in different situations, to be able to communicate fluently. Fine. And how will we do that? Again, by communicating fluently. So this is the means and also the end. Fine. You mean that the means, of course, the process. So once you make that communication, the process of something, so finally you can achieve that product. Is that clear? So our process is communication and our product will be communication. I hope you understand. The point is that why? If you do not focus on the process, so you cannot have the product. So that's why you have to input, in fact, you have to work hard in the process of language teaching. So in the process, of course, if you put efforts in the process, if you make your students communicate, and what happens? Obviously, the student will achieve that goal. So in simple words, I would say it, right? What happens? This is an approach that is CLT, of course, communicative language teaching approach, which says, what is that? Objective is communication, and how? Through communication. This is what CLT says. Clear? No? You want more interpretation? So it's very simple. Okay, fine, good question. That it says that what? Communicative language teaching. See? So what is communicative approach, for example? The approach says that, see, you should be able to communicate your ideas. Fine. And you know that what does linguistics say? Linguistics says that if you are able to communicate your message to your listener, well, language is working. Fine. So you have communicated your message. Simple, from the word communicate, communication. So here we have communicative. So we call it communicative language teaching. So my dear students, what happens that, well, the communicative approach is the approach that wants to achieve the objective for that fluent communication. How? Again, through this process. So this is what this CLT says, that to be able, the learner should be able to communicate in the target language fluently. And what teacher tries, the teacher tries his level best, being of course the teacher of that language. He tries to bring that communication in the teaching process. Like we saw in the class proceeding, we saw in the experience what happens, that there are 20 students in fact, and they are immigrants. They have lived in US for last 2 years, and they are the learners in fact. Fine. And what happens? We saw all the activities that, well, the teacher in fact give them different tasks. They in fact they work in groups. Fine. They give their own opinions. Fine. They give linguist items. So what? Interaction is there, of course, right? Teacher brings authentic material, teacher brings news reports, right? And the teacher brings in fact of course different games. What happens? The student keep on communicating in fact. So that is the ultimate goal of communication, to be able to communicate your message, to be able to argue your listener, right? To persuade your in fact listener, fine, to inform, right? To give message to your listener. So this is the purpose of the communication, and that's why this approach, that is communicative language, the teaching approach, talks about this, that CLT, fine, communicative language teaching in fact, that of course you teach that language, and now in our case particularly English language, that student would be able to communicate in that language. And if you talk about with other methods, for example, other methods, yes, they talk about vocabulary, they talk about the grammar, and their ultimate goal was definitely to be able to communicate in the target language. But what did they say? They say yes, through vocabulary and through grammar. But here this method says that, well, this grammar and vocabulary are not enough. Fine, if you know the usage of the language, it's good, but these things are not enough to be able to communicate. Of course, you might have seen many people, they have vocabulary, they know grammar, but they are not capable to communicate. And you must have seen people who may not have good knowledge of the grammar, fine, but what they do, they in fact they are able to communicate. Like you see, of course, but that the point is that this communicative approach says that you should be able to use the language. Fine. If you know about the language, if you have knowledge about the language, so that is one aspect. But if you are unable to communicate that language, so it means that language, of course, you need to work on that. It means that there is no practical utility of that language, so applied linguistics is not there. But if you are able to communicate that language, no matter you don't know the grammar, the structure, but again, you of course, you know how to use that language. Again, of course, the competence and performance of the language, right? The competence, yes, you may have the knowledge of the language, but once the performance, see, so you see, the performance means that the speaker is able to communicate that language. Is that clear? So this is what the objective of this method is, that the learner should be able to communicate in the target language, and what the teacher tries, he teaches that language and of course with this approach in mind. Fine. So what he does, that he keeps on interacting. Yes, he gives situations, and the students keep on interacting in fact. Fine. Either there is a game, either there is of course opinion based the questions. So in every activity we see that the student, they interact, and the teacher in fact oversees them, teacher monitors them, right? Sometimes they work in a group of 3, sometimes they work in a group of 5. Fine. So sometimes they play some games, sometimes they give their opinions. So what is it? And the teacher brings what? Authentic material. He brings a news report, right? And of course, and then sometimes he brings sentences, and he asks the students to put sentences in order, where again the underlying, of course, the principle is to be fine, what, to inculcate coherence, in fact cohesion among the sentences. And then there is what, a strip story is also there, fine, where their pictures are there, of course, and you see there are 4 or 5 pictures are there, and what happens, you see one student has those 5 pictures, and then what happens that he gives first picture to his group members, and they see that picture, and then they guess, they predict what could be the next picture, and then the student who has a picture, he gives the second picture, and then they, of course, link that, either they were right or wrong. And then again after, of course, they're joining two pictures, then they look for a third picture, fine. And again what happens, that they ask the question, the student to the one who has pictures, then what could be the next picture, in fact. So they keep on interacting, they guess, in fact, they predict, fine, and then of course if their predictions come true, then another picture is there. So in this way they complete the story, fun, whatever the pictures are available. Then what happens after that, again, you see, to be more creative, you see, they try to make their own stories. Is that clear, students? So this is what we see in the class proceeding, that of course the whole the time, what happens, you see, there were a lot of communication, and students were communicating, and they were communicating, of course, fluently, in fact. And this is what the teacher wants in this method, that the student would be able to communicate, in fact. And then another, of course, we see that there are a group of 4 students, and one becomes the boss, other becomes the employee. Fine. And what happens, you see, then supposing they are going to have a merger with another company, and before having that merger, what they do, yeah, they in fact have a meeting, fine. They talks about pros and cons, they talks about the good and the bad point of this, and finally what happens, you see, they in fact reach a conclusion. And here, of course, the boss listens to his employees, and of course the employees, what, again, it's a situational base, fine. And generally, of course, we face situations, and this situation, you being the teacher, you can, of course, bring in innovation in this situation, fine. For example, you can change that situation. You can say, well, in a home, for example, yes, the father wants to shift the home, and he asks his sons and the daughters, and then they in fact negotiate there, of course. Is that clear? So this is what, of course, we see that once. And then what happens in this way, the teacher goes to all the groups, in fact, he facilitates them, he listens to their arguments, and then also he helps them, of course, and the students learn some new vocabulary items as well. Is that clear? Do you understand? Am I going fast? Should I be slow? Alright, so students, in simple words, CLT talks about what? Yeah, it's a approach, fine, where foreign language is taught how? By using that language communicatively, fine. And our goal is communication, and means, again, communication. I hope you understand. Mean you want to be a successful person, of course, how? Yes, by being the part of that success. That's why, my dear student, that we focus on the process. Like talking about the writing, so process writing is focused. Talking about the listening, you want to be a good listener, again the process should be highlighted. You want to be a good reader, again the process of reading should be worked on, and only then you'll be able to a good reader. So that's why the process, you want your learners, you being teacher, you being TEFL student, you want your learner to be able to communicate in that language. So what you do, yeah, you make that as a means, like we see in the class. So if you are following this method in the class, then you need to be more in fact creative. Your activities should be based on more what? Interaction, where student would negotiate, the student would have dialogues, they would have role plays, fine, and they can have as many activities as you want them to do. And the point is, objective is that they would not look here and there, they would be talking fine, and they would be interacting, and only then, of course, the purpose of this method can be fulfilled. Fine. All right. So dear students, I mean this method, of course, the CLT, we of course who gave this? Yeah, the approach, oral approach we call it, and again situational language teaching. So this is a British approach. Which one? CLT. Why? Of course, because over there, you see, definitely, I mean the learner tries to communicate in that language. You see in Urdu, for example, of course, most of us, I mean, communicate in that Urdu. But when it comes to writing, you find it hard. You find it hard to write a letter, of course, of, for example, 200 words. Sometimes you find it hard. But if you have to write, if you have to communicate, अगर आपको उर्दू में बात करनी पड़े, तो आप शायद घंटों बात कर लेंगे. लेकिन जब आपको लिखनी पड़े, of course, when you have to write Urdu, so you find it hard. Clear? So is the case, of course, this approach, right? What do we call it? We call it British approach that follows what? The oral, in fact. This CLT follows oral approach or situational language teaching. CLT follows situational language teaching, right? And that is with also with simultaneous with direct method that we talked about. I gave you, in fact, earlier that in the direct method, we teach a foreign language. Fine. How? Through the target language, with the target language. Is that clear, students? Do you understand? All right. So, move on. Good. So, dear students, of course, this decline of second language teaching, of course, similar to this direct method, was due to Chomsky's influence. In fact, in Britain, of course, the functional and communicative aspects gain prominence. Right? You see, of course, that this point that, see, this focus should be on what? On functions of language, right? And also communicative aspects, they gain prominence, in fact. So this is, once we see that, of course, this structuralism approach, that well, the language should be habit formation, right? You talk about audio-lingual method, fine. And we saw in that, and there we saw that structures are there. Structures were, in fact, focused. But after that, we see that there was a shift from those structures to cognition. Cognitive, of course, that well, you, of course, there are languages there, and you have this hemispheres, you have left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And what happens? Yeah, so this was the view, in fact, and from that, what you see in Britain, what happens? The functional and communicative aspect of the language, they, of course, mean definitely became more of course, more prominent, because language, in fact, is for communication. And again, we cannot have some patterns, right? And we cannot learn patterns, of course. Language is what? Is a thinking process. Language is cognitive process where you keep on thinking and you keep on formulating hypotheses. And then you keep on judging your hypotheses whether they are valid or they are invalid. Is that clear? So that's why, of course, once we saw that structuralist approach or the behaviorist approaches, I mean, we found them that they were, in fact, the failures, that we could not have the patterns, and how many patterns would you learn, which is not humanly possible. So then there was a shift from those behaviors, drills, to what? Cognitions. And that's why, of course, this communicative approach, in fact, got fame. So again, what happened in the US? While in the US, what innates and what generatives of language were important. Innates means, it's a theory, of course, right? And we'll see what this theory talks about, right? And of course, under Chomsky's influence, what happens? In Britain, communication was important, in fact. So under this Chomsky's influence, you see that we saw earlier that once he talked about that, Chomsky talked about this cognitive process, that language learning, in fact, is what? See, I mean, it is not habit, but it is rule formation. Fine, that of course you keep on formulating rules and you keep on judging your rules. And if you feel that your hypothesis is true, if you feel that your message brought the right response, it means your hypothesis were valid. And if you find that you could not get the desired response, so your hypothesis was invalid. In fact, this innate hypothesis, what is it? Is a linguistic theory of language acquisition which holds that at least some linguistic knowledge exists in human at birth. Fine. So there is of course innate, this US theory. What is innate theory? This says that of course at the time of birth we do have some language items, we do have some language, and of course you know that before the birth it's very clear that language cells have developed, and even a child in fact before birth he starts listening, right? And of course in that the movie you might have watched, In the Womb, where of course we see that, well, a child can distinguish in fact between harsh sound and the soft sounds. So that is, you see, we have once we come on earth, and in fact, so what happens at the time of birth? Yes, that child in fact does have what? Knowledge, in fact have some linguistic knowledge in his mind. Is that clear? Fine. Okay students, this is of course mean the point like we talked about earlier here, that the US innates and what? Generatives of language were important. So how? This is the point is that how, what is generative linguistics? What is a school of thought? Well students, now what is generative linguistics? Is a school of thought within linguistics that makes use what? Of this concept of generative grammar. Now what is generative grammar, my dear students? Different people in fact have different ways, have used different ways, and different in fact the term generative grammar is used in different ways by different people. So you can have a definition on your slide. It is what? It is defined as a type of grammar which describes a language in terms of a set of logical rules formulated so as to be capable of generating the infinite number of possible sentences of that language and providing them with the correct structural description. This is what definition is there, that it is, and if you try to interpret it, what is it, my dear students? That what is generative, in fact this generative grammar? It's a grammar which describes what? Describes language. Again, what? Descriptive. Describe language in terms of set of some rules. Fine. Formulated so as to be able, of course, so as to be capable of generating infinite number of possible sentences of that language. Very simple as this said, that this is of course, this is a grammar in fact that helps us in formulating as many number of sentences as we can. Why? Because it in fact it gives us some set of infinite rules. Is that clear? That is what generative grammar in linguistics paper in fact you must have discussed that. So over there you can see the details. Well, so my dear student, this is coming back to this communicative language teaching. So many methods in fact claim to be communicative. Of course, if you see all the methods that we talked about, every method in fact tries to somehow to help the learner communicate in the language. And even of course when a learner learns a foreign language, so the purpose should be there definitely. The purpose is to be able to communicate that language. And see, every method says that. Fine. And of course all these methods, I mean, the people in fact who in fact develop the methods, fine, they say that of course they focus on what? Structure and vocabulary in fact, right? That of course structuralism and again the vocabulary, the words, these methods are of the view that the structure of a sentence, mean the grammar and vocabulary are important for communication. Whereas communicative approach, what does this approach says? That they are not good enough. We cannot get ready for communication if just vocabulary and structure are worked on. This is what the communicative approach says. We need more, right? To be able to communicate, right? To be able to communicate our message communicatively, we need more. We cannot rely only on vocabulary item. We cannot rely only on what? The structures or the grammatical patterns. We need more in fact for what? To be able to communicate well. This is what the communicative approach says, that, and of course because communication includes what? Of course include functions, right? What we do with the language. What we do with language? Yes, we of course we argue in that language. Fine. So again, we should be able to argue our point of view, what, confidently. Then again, we should be able to persuade. We should be able to, in fact, make promises, in fact. And again, we should be able to reject or accept an invitation. Fine. These are different functions of the language. Form is there, right? But again, functions, of course. So of course, if the teacher, in fact, teaches language in this perspective, that the learner, in fact, of course, learner is able to communicate, right, in the target language, or learner is capable enough to communicate in that language. So definitely these are the functions of the language, that what language does. Language, in fact, rejects any proposal. What you see, what else? Language, in fact, we argue in that language, of course. What else we do? We promise, in fact, we make promises. Fine. At times we have to break promises, and then yes, something is, we have to reject an invitation, or we have to accept an invitation. So all these situations, they are different functions of language. So only, of course, mean that this is what the communication, in fact. Fine. So once you teach this language with this approach, fine, with the communicative approach, fine, what happens? The learner will be able to communicate in all different situations, right? He'll be able to argue his point of view. He'll be able to, in fact, persuade his client or customer, or he'll be able to invite, find somebody, or he'll be able to reject an invitation. So this is what the purpose, of course, functions of the communication are. And that's why the communicative approach, in fact, incorporates all these functions. Fine, students. So in fact, if you talk about this approach, that what is the underlying feature, in fact. So these functions we talk about, all these functions we see, they happen inside a social context. All right, students. So all these functions, what? They take place in a specific situation, in a social context. So again, in fact, Wilkins' function is very important. Wilkins' functional notional approach form the basis of communicative approach. So you might be thinking that what is the underlying, of course, the theory behind this communicative approach. So we have an answer. Wilkins' functional, I'll show you the image also, that this way Wilkins, of course, is a functional notion approach form the basis of communicative basis. So what happens? In 1972, the British linguist D.A. Wilkins published a document that proposed a radical shift away from using the traditional concept of grammar and vocabulary to describe language to an analysis of communicative meaning that learner would need in order to express themselves and to understand effectively. See, this was, right, the basis of this communicative approach. And who gave this? Wilkins. And this Wilkins' functional notional approach is very famous, and that, of course, in fact, makes what? The basis, in fact, the foundation of the theory, the communicative approach. And on the slide you can see what is this Wilkins approach, in fact, what is this Wilkins method, and who was he? He was a linguist, and he, of course, he shifted, there was a shift from the old vocabulary and grammar to what? More, of course, for communication, that language should be used for communicative the purpose is, as compared to, right, or rather, as you can say, that old traditional, the grammar and vocabulary. So that is what the base of what we can say, this communicative approach. So the students talking about the functions, that what we do with the language, but notational categories are, like functions are, like Wilkins, what? If you see it again here, what is it? This functional, of course, notional approach. Now see here, functions are what we do with the language, like we talk about arguing, we talk about persuading, we talk about invitation, we talk about rejection, you talk about showing happiness, we talk about showing your sadness and all that. But again, what notional categories are? What? Time, sequence, quantity, location, and frequency. How often, for example, right? Where exactly? I mean, how many? Fine. Sequence, the order, and then the time. Fine. These are what we call them notional categories. Fine. Which categories? Notional categories. And this might help you. You can have this. This is a functional, I mean, Wilkins functional notion approach. You see on that, on this side, there are objectives, notions, and functions. Clear? So we call it functional notion approach. See, in function you can see, student, example, you can have a look that in function what happens? Communicative act, use of language for achieve a purpose. Function, and then you have notions, and then you have objectives. On other side, you see what? The other points, of course, they are what? Criticism, advantages, function categories. Is that clear? So what do we call it? Functional notional approach. Functional notional approach, that is what is the base of communicative approach. Clear? Fine, good. So dear students, that this in fact is the communicative approach. What happens in this approach? Yes, the communicative language teaching that we talk about, that functional approach, notional functional approach have almost the same goals. Very important point. What is it? That communicative approach and communicative language teaching approach. I tell you student one thing, that maybe you are confused that what is this communicative approach. In your book you might find the title, the communicative approach, and also CLT. They are both the two names of the same method. You can call it communicative approach or you can call it communicative language teaching. Okay, students? So communicative approach and communicative language teaching. What happens? And again, functional approach and notional functional approach almost have the same goals. Fine. The goal is, what are the goals? You know the goal of communicative approach? Yeah, to be able to communicate in the target language fluently. Fine. So this is what the goal is. It means the goals of all these, what the approaches are same. So in fact, students, when talk about the knowledge of forms and meanings and functions can be positive if they help the learner in the process of meaning exchange. Clear? So if you have the knowledge, example, you have knowledge of the language, fine, you know you have the you know how to use that language, and you know in fact the functions and the meanings. If they are positive, if they help the learner in the process of meaning exchange. Fine. If you know the functions, if you know the notions, in fact, if you know the forms, fine. And if they all help you, right, in communicating your viewpoint, so it means that is fine. Fine. If these things, in fact, these concepts, the knowledge, right, of forms, I mean form mean the form of course, form the language, in fact, right. So and then the meaning, the semantics, and also the functions. Either you are agreeing, you are rejecting, whatever, and can be useful if they help you. Fine. They help the learner in the process of meaning exchange. If your learner, in fact, your student knows what are the forms, if you know form of the language, mean form of the language, the sentence pattern, and if you know functions of the language, of course, that where to use that, I mean, that sentence, for example, when to use give me a book or when to use please give me a book. If he knows that form and if he knows functions, right, and it could be positive, it could be useful, provided the learner, of course, what happens, he can easily use that for exchange of meaning. So as far as this the communicative approach is concerned, there are two versions of communicative approach. One, the weak version, we call it standard, in fact. Fine. So, and second is what? First one is the weak version, we also call it standard version. Well, students, so talking about this communicative language teaching, so this communicative approaches, in fact, there are two versions of communicative approach. One, we call it weak version, right? Or we can also call it standard version. So the goal is to provide chances to use language for communication. This is what we call it, the weak version. And what is the objective? What is the goal? To be right, to use that language for communication, right? Of course, the approach is definitely communicative, that whatever language you are learning, right, your goal, fine, should be to be able to use that language for exchanging your views, for communicating your views. So that is one weak version of this communicative approach. Then we also call it what? Learning to use our language for communication, right? And again here, of course, there are many, of course, speakers of the language, so they know how to use that language. Maybe they have acquired this language as language 1, right? Or there are so many people, of course, who have gone to, of course, an English speaking the country, and they have learned that language by listening over there. So they, in fact, see, their this approach is what we call it weak approach, and then they have learned, in fact, that language to use. So language for communication, and maybe they are not able to write that language. For example, in our country, so many people are there, they speak Urdu, but if you ask them to write, they may not be able to write Urdu, in fact. So their approach, of course, that approach is the weak approach, that they have learned that language for communication, and they see, and they are doing it. Second is what? The strong version is what? Language as communication, using language to learn also. Here is what mean the step here, that of course the communicative approach. The second version is, that is strong version, that language as communication. And of course, definitely, you see that, of course, once the language, in fact, encapsulates everything. Language, in fact, and of course, gives you history. Language gives you what? Literature. So through language, right, you come to know. So language, what? As communication. So they are different, of course. Either you are talking about the literary language, you're talking about scientific language, you're talking about, in fact, biological language. So language as communication, using language to learn. Fine. Definitely when you read research articles, you read, then of course you use that language to learn because somebody has written that. Fine. And of course somebody has penned down ideas, and once you read, you learn, in fact. And once you write, others would read. So this is what the strong version, that, and if you see the language to learn, either you write, you use productive skills, fine, speaking or writing, or you use receptive skills, listening or what? Reading. So that is a strong version of communicative approach, that language, fine, for to learn. All right. So this, dear students, this linguistic theory behind communicative approach is again Delheim's. Fine. So Delheim's communicative approach, of course, is behind this. Earlier we talked about, if you remember, that earlier we talked about, my dear students, that approach. What was that? Remember? Think of it. What is it? Shall I go back to show the slides? Okay, wait. I'll take you here, students. What is it? Here we talk about, yeah, that this Wilkins functional notion approach, fine, that formed the basis of communicative approach. So that is, here we saw, and now here we see what we call it, that the theory behind is, yeah, that makes the basis, and here the theory behind this communicative approach is Delheim's communicative competence in 1972. So what is this communicative competence? Yeah, is a term coined by the person, and then what happens? In reaction to Noam Chomsky's 1965 notion of linguistic competence, right? So Noam Chomsky talks about linguistic competence, and then you see in 1966 Delheim's, he gave this, in fact he coined this term, and he called it communicative competence. So that linguistic competence by Noam Chomsky, and then communicative competence by Delheim's, right? And what does it say? Is the intuitive functional knowledge and control of the principles of language usage. This is what the Delheim says, that it is what? See, what is it? The communicative competence is the intuition. See, there was in simple words, what we can say that whatever you internalize, functional knowledge and control of principles of language use. And you can see on the slide whatever this Himes observes. A normal child acquires knowledge of sentences not only as grammatical but also as appropriate. You see, the native speaker's knowledge of language. He or she acquires competence as to when to speak, fine, when not, and as to what to talk about, with whom, when, where, in what manner. Fine. In short, a child becomes able to accomplish a repertoire of speech acts, to take part in speech events, and to evaluate their accomplishments by others. See, I mean, a child, this is what Delheim says, that child, in fact, what he does, that he, in fact, acquires knowledge of what sentences, not only as grammatical, but also as appropriate. I mean, a child, sometimes children hesitate, sometimes when the children, and again the children behavior, of course, how do they behave in school, how do they behave in their homes, right? And which expression, the language expression they use in their homes, which language expression they use in their schools, and which language expression they use with the outsiders. So again, this is what Delheim observes, right? That a child not only acquires that the grammatical part, but also appropriacy. He learns what to say, when to say, what not to say, and how to say, how to talk to your elders, how to talk to your juniors, in fact, youngers. So this is what a child learns, appropriacy as well. This is what Delheim says, and this is what resistance to Noam Chomsky's linguistic competence. And again, this Delheim believes that Chomsky's linguistic competence was too limited. Fine? Linguistic competence doesn't justify social and functional rules of the language. This is what Delheim says, that he criticizes Noam Chomsky, that his theory, of course, of linguistic competence, that says language knowledge. For example, linguistic competence means that linguistic knowledge, of course, right? That of course, Noam Chomsky, see, his theory, of course, doesn't talk about appropriacy or what? Social context. Fine. So Delheim, in fact, incorporates what? Social context in, of course, rules of the language. So dear students, in fact, again, if you move on with Delheim's, so in fact, Heim's competence deal with both knowledge and use, right? Both, that whatever you have the competence and also performance. I mean, the knowledge of the language that you have, and also you use that knowledge. In fact, sometimes you only have the knowledge but you can't use. But the Delheim's, in fact, his competence deals with both the things, what? The knowledge, and also what? The usage of that knowledge. Delheim talks about that. And then, this is all, students, of course, this lecture today. It was the first lecture on this CLT. Fine. So what is it, my dear students? Yeah, CLT, or the communicative approach, is an approach to language teaching that emphasizes interaction as both the means and the ultimate goal of study. Fine. Again, at the end, if you say that, well, this approach, this CLT, or we also call it communicative approach, achieves, in fact, wants to have a communicative ability, wants to enhance communicative ability of the learners. How? By using this of course, this communication. So I told you that our means, of course, are communication, and our ends are also communication, like we did with direct method. And again, here we saw that the teacher comes in the class and he gives direction in the target language. He communicates, in fact, but the point is that his situations, what he does in the class, that he keeps on, in fact, giving activity to his students, and the student in fact remain busy in interacting. They in fact give their views on different situations. Sometimes they argue, sometimes they guess, sometimes they use probability, sometimes they use the modal verbs. Fine. At times they try to persuade, at times they reject, at times they accept. Fine. At times they predict, at times they link, find the stories. So all that, and again the material we saw is authentic one. The teacher brings an article, on sports article of course, and then he asks the students to predict who will win the World Cup, and student gives their comments. Fine. And again the teacher asks that what else can you say if one student gives a comment. So that can be said in other way. If different linguistic items could be given, and at the end what do? We compare those items with the original in fact that material that you have. So that's why in fact authentic material we call it. So again the learner should be able to communicate in the target language, and they should be able to use the language that is in. So when the teacher brings a newspaper of course, or he brings any handout from the prevailing in fact resources, so definitely once you bring an article from there's of course the current issues, so student would definitely involve themselves in that, and they would be familiar with the language which is in. For example, if you take a handout from 1995, so then things were different. Is that clear? So dear students, this was the first introductory lecture on this communicative language teaching. So today what we did, first of all, we reviewed the previous lecture, that was total physical response, and then we started another important method, and this one was CLT, communicative language teaching. So this was the just introduction. I hope you have an idea what is CLT, and we will continue this CLT in the coming lectures. With this, I thank you all. I want you to read the chapter so that you would be able to grasp things well in the next lecture. Thank you very much. See you in the next class. Goodbye.